Good morning. Hope that your Wednesday is off to a good start. Mine is so far. I've got a good cup of coffee here with me. And like last week, we'll take a few minutes and reflect on the sermon text for this coming Sunday. The text for this coming Sunday is again from Mark. It's from chapter 1. And it's 29 through 39. And immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her, and he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door, and he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him, and they found him and said, "Everyone is looking for you." And he said to them, "Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in the synagogues and casting out demons. So that is the text for this coming Sunday. It's just a follow-on to what we read this past week. Pardon me, just going to angle this just a little bit differently. That's, like I said, just the follow-on to last week, which was the dramatic account of Jesus' first sermon in the synagogue there in Capernaum, where he casts out a demon, an evil spirit. Personally, I mentioned this Sunday morning in church, in worship, that I love preaching the first 2 or 3 chapters of Mark. Mark has a power all its own. Mark has all of the subtlety of a shotgun or a 2x4 up beside your head. Over and over again in Mark, particularly in the first several chapters, you find the Greek word. The Greek word is euthus, and it is normally translated immediately. And so if you've got a more literal English translation, you will notice immediately. Some other translations will try to, like the NIV, might use at once or quickly or something, but a more literal one is going to have immediately, and immediately this, and immediately that. And that gives it a lot of power of its own. Mark doesn't have the artistry of Luke, not nearly the artistry of Luke. Mark doesn't have the depth of John, but it's got a power it's got a power nonetheless, a power all its own that comes from just how active we find Jesus. This is a portrayal of Jesus as very active and always on the move. And if you really get into it, it's sort of a tragic figure of Jesus. Nobody really gets him or understands him except for the demons. So, but anyway, I don't want to get too far into the weeds just talking about Mark in general. So what's going on in the text? What we find here takes place all in the span of like 18 hours. So Jesus leaves the synagogue and walks 50 yards down the path to Peter's house. And if you go to Capernaum now, it literally is about 50 yards. If you go to Capernaum, you can look at the ruins of a 4th century synagogue that was built over the site of the original 1st century synagogue where Jesus would have preached and taught. So there are the ruins of the synagogue. Right beside that are the ruins of the synagogue ruler's house, and we know him by the name of Jairus in the Gospels. And then right beside Jairus's house is the remains of Peter's house. There's synagogue, Jairus's house, and Peter's house. And the Roman Catholic Church, I think, is the Franciscans have built this like spaceship-looking chapel over the remains of Peter's house. It's pretty neat architecturally. The thing looks like a spaceship, and it's sort of built over the remains of Peter's house, so you can look underneath the chapel and you can see the stonework there. So Jesus gets back to Peter's house. He's there with Peter and Andrew and James and John, and somebody tells him that Peter's mother-in-law is sick with a fever. And so he heals her, and then at sundown, when the travel restrictions for the Sabbath have passed, the Sabbath goes from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. At sundown, when it's free to move about, apparently the whole town shows up at Peter's door. And everybody who's sick and everybody who's got a demon, and Peter when Jesus just heals people right and left, casts out a bunch of demons till well into the night. And then early the next morning, while it was still dark, so whatever time this was, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, Jesus gets up, leaves the house, walks out into the countryside near Capernaum, and there he prays. And Peter and his buddies realize Jesus isn't there, and he goes out and searches for Jesus and ultimately finds him. And Jesus says, "Nope, we can't stay here. We got to keep going." And then it's a beautiful passage. It's not, pardon me, it's a powerful passage. And it's not, I don't know that it's beautiful, but it's powerful. And there's so much going on in there, you could probably find half a dozen different ways to preach it, because there's a lot of different little pieces that make it up. So what I want to really focus on today is, the raising, the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. The first thing is, notice that Peter is married. Most of the early apostles apparently were married, and their wives accompanied them many times on missionary journeys. Paul refers to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And it does strike me curious that our Roman Catholic friends enforce a celibate priesthood, but the earliest apostles themselves were primarily married men. But be that as it may, Peter's mother-in-law has a fever, and they all rush out to tell Jesus, "Hey, she's got a fever. What can you do?" And so Peter goes in there, takes her by the hand, and raises her up. This is an event that apparently must have been important in the earliest Christian movement, as it's recorded in all 3 synoptic gospels. It's here right up front in Mark. Luke records it in Luke 4. Matthew records it in Matthew chapter 8. And what does Mark say? "And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. And the fever left her, and she began to serve them." He took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. It's easy and it's tempting as Americans to read this incorrectly, I think. As Americans, it's in our DNA to think in terms of rights. What are my rights? What am I entitled to? Going back to Thomas Jefferson, created with certain inalienable rights. We think we read this in terms of rights as good Americans, and so we read this something like this. Here she is, she's been laying in bed, burning up with a fever on death's doorstep, and as soon as she gets healed, she has to get up and start waiting on him hand and foot. That's not fair, that's not right. That's how it's tempting for us to read it that way. I want to offer up another way to understand this, another way to look at it. There's more going on here than that. She is the matriarch of the family, probably, and that is a culture which values hospitality more than ours does. Providing hospitality and looking after guests was extremely important in that culture. It still is now, particularly among the Bedouins. I don't know whether it's still that way in Israeli culture right now, but in the ancient Near East, hospitality and providing for guests was extremely important, and it would have been her thing as matriarch of the family to oversee that. And so she's healed, and how does she respond? She responds by making certain everybody's taken care of. And so look at this as she is restored to her rightful place. As she's restored to her rightful place. A place that in her mind would have been one of honor. Also think about this. The verb that is used that's used here for he lifted her up is the same one that is used in Mark 16 when the angel says to the women that have gone to the tomb that Jesus was raised. It's the same Greek word. And so I think we can very legitimately look at this healing as being connected to the resurrection. This, in essence, prefigures the resurrection that would come at the end of Mark, and really at the end of all four Gospels. See, she is raised to new life. Not literally resurrection because she hasn't died yet, but she is clearly quite ill. She's raised to newness of life. And how does she respond? She responds by being raised to newness of life by serving Jesus, by serving the Christ who healed her. And if you think about it, isn't that what all of discipleship is about? That, my friends, is all of what discipleship is. Discipleship is those who have been healed by Christ, and all of us who call upon his name have been healed by him in one form or another, spiritually or physically. Discipleship is simply those who have been healed by Christ responding in a life of service to him and others. So in this one brief little healing that is just in a couple of verses here in Mark, we find in a nutshell all of what discipleship is. Discipleship is simply those who have been healed by Christ responding in a life of service to Him and others. Hope that's been a great word for you this Wednesday morning. Have a good rest of your day.